Hi everyone. Let's take a look at the gradient tool in Illustrator. With this tool, you can, and with gradient fills, not only fills but strokes, you can take your artwork from flat, kind of decorative to more dimensional and plastic very quickly. So let's dig right in. Let's start with a simple linear gradient. So on the body of the fox here, and again, meet Mr. Fox if you haven't met him already. Over here at the bottom of the toolbox, right, you're going to see the fill and the stroke for each object you select. And right below it, I want to point out there's a color fill, a gradient fill, and no fill. And you can actually choose the shortcuts, right? The greater than symbol, the less than symbol, and the forward slash as a way to very quickly fill an object with one of those options. So, like for instance, the shortcut to fill with the gradient is the greater than button, right? Now, you can also simply click on that button down here, or you can go over to your fill in your properties panel, right, over here, click on that and choose a gradient that already exists. But I just hit the less than button on the keyboard to quickly fill with a gradient. Now, this is not the gradient colors that I want, but when you fill an object with a gradient, the gradient panel pops up, and here are all my wonderful gradient options, right? Linear gradient, radial gradient, and freeform gradient, which is really cool. More about that later. You have the choice to edit the gradient and change the rotation of the gradient, and here's the gradient ramp, this slider down here, and it allows you to choose your colors and create kind of custom gradients. So let's do that. Down here, I want this not to be black and white, but I want to change each one of these. I just double-clicked that point here on the gradient slider, and it's set to use black. Of course, I've got, color swatches here that I can click on and, add an orange to it, right? What orange do I want? Maybe this one. Okay, well, anyway, let's go to the other side now, double click that white, and we're going to choose like a lighter orange, right? Okay, so a little bit more subtlety. Now, I'm going to grab that lighter color, move it over here. And by the way, if I decide it's not light enough, I could always, double click this and go back to my color palette here. And a little known trick is if you want to lighten a color kind of on the fly, if you've got the RGB sliders or the CMYK sliders, you can hold down the Shift key, grab one of those sliders and drag it to the right, and it's going to lighten that same color, right? Keep the color consistent, but just give us a lighter version of it. Likewise, if you hold down Shift and drag to the left, it's going to get create a darker version of that color. Anyway, so now check this out. I want the gradient to go from dark to light to dark. So I'm going to take my dark gradient over here. Now I could just simply click to add another point there. And by the way, if you click a point and you decide you don't want to just drag it off the edge of the panel, I'm going to duplicate this gradient slider on the other side here. And remember, the Option or Alt key is the key that copies stuff. So I'm going to hold down the Option key and click and drag another color point to the other side of that slider. All right. So, and of course I can adjust, exactly where that falls in the gradient. And there's even a midpoint here where I can kind of make that more subtle if I wanted to, or more dramatic. Lots of control. Okay. So there we go. I've got a custom gradient. Okay, so let's say I want even more control. I could come up to the Edit Gradient button on the panel here, or I can just choose the gradient tool in the toolbox, right? That's essentially what happens when you click on the gradient button here, Edit Gradient. It selects the gradient tool. Shortcut is G for gradient, right? And so now I can see like in a more visual way how that gradient is being applied, right? All right, so let's jump ahead. Let's go to the fox's head, jump ahead, and apply a radial gradient here, right? So I'm going to come over here to my gradient panel, click on Radial Gradient. And now it's using the previous gradient that I created. So I need to make a little modification here. I don't want there to be a dark point in the center of his head. So I'm going to take this gradient slider and get rid of it. All right. And so once again, if I have the gradient tool selected, I can kind of modify how that gradient behaves. All right. So you can make a gradient go in a radial fashion as well as a linear fashion. And while I'm at it, I know that these two guys here, let me zoom in, the eyelids, looks like they're grouped. Let me make sure that I just get those, use the direct selection tool to select part of a group instead of the whole thing. Okay, and so I'm going to add that same gradient, that radial gradient. Again, if I hit the less than button, it'll fill with the last gradient that I used. And here I can, get that gradient tool, hit the G key to get the gradient tool, and kind of position it. Oops, grab the wrong thing. If you click on the white line for the gradient, you can reposition it. And then, of course, you can position where the color stops are. You can also, change the shape of it or the radius of it with these two black handles up here. All right. Okay, so do the same thing over here, reposition it to the center, and then modify the radius. Okay, there we go. That looks better. Okay, so let's do an ear. All right, let me select that ear. And once again, I'm going to hit the less than button on the keyboard. And this time, instead of radial, I'm going to switch back to a linear gradient. Right? See that? Make sure that you can choose what kind of gradient here and your gradient panel. Now, in this case, I still have the gradient tool selected. G key on the keyboard is a shortcut. All right, so if you bring your cursor to this black square on the gradient, just outside of it, you get the rotate symbol, right? And then you can click and drag to rotate its direction. And again, click on the line itself to reposition it. And then you can move the slider where you want that gradient to begin. Get the idea? And we can do the same thing over here. Hit the less than button to apply a gradient instead of a simple color fill. Bring your cursor right to that square to rotate it the direction that you want it to go. Right. Lengthen it a bit. Position it. Okay. You get the idea? All right, so that's looking pretty good. So let's try a freeform gradient. So the fox's tail is kind of a funky shape, and I want to kind of create a custom gradient that kind of fits it. So I'm going to select it and click on the Freeform Gradient button over here in the Gradient panel, right? See it? Okay, so when you select the Freeform Gradient for a shape, Illustrator kind of examines the color that's already on it and some of the other colors in the image and just kind of randomly applies them. And then you have to edit it to get it to look the way you want. So each one of these little points is a color stop, right? And I can click on it. In fact, I can double click it and choose, the color that I want for it. So I'm going to go through like these on the outside, double click them, add a gradient, add a color to that stop, making these all kind of a red orange out here on the edges. Of course, I can reposition them and I can, change their radius. All right, so I'm gonna put one on each one of these. Double click, change the color. And by the way, if you add one that you don't want, like if I click one here, and I decide that I don't want it, I can just drag it off the edge and it goes away, right, outside of the shape. So, and I know this doesn't look like much yet, but I'm just kind of setting the stage. So now I can click like inside here and change to a lighter color, right? And in fact, I want to point out to you that, like say I wanted to put a kind of a highlight strip through the middle of this on a curve, I can do that. So, but I'm going to switch from like these points, right, that have a radius like this. I'm going to change from that. I'm going to pull this one off to get rid of it. I'm going to switch to lines. So if you notice over here, I've got the option to draw points or lines, right? So I'm going to switch to lines now, and I'm going to click a point here, double click it to give it kind of a light yellow. In fact, let me do this. I'll make it a light orange and then go to my color options, and I'm going to shift click and drag that to the right to lighten it up. Okay, that'll be my highlight color. So now this is a line. Watch this. I've got it selected. I move, say, to the center of the tail and click. It adds another one, and you see they're connected. Now I can go a little further and click again, and it creates a curve. You see that? So if you wanted to create a streak of color through an object, switch from points to lines. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, so freeform gradient, linear gradient, radial gradient, all great stuff. Now, I want to show you also, before we finish up, drawing, adding a gradient to a stroke. So I'm going to create a line here. Just simple, kind of, about a 3-inch line here. And I'm going to give it, say a kind of a dark blue to be a contrast to the orange. I'm going to set it, bump it up to about 12 points. So let me zoom in on that. And I want rounded ends, right? These strokes usually look better with a rounded cap. You see that? You've got options for how you end a stroke. In this one, I'm going to choose a round cap. So check this out. I'm also going to apply an effect to this. So I want to make sure that the stroke is active. So again, if you look in the bottom of your toolbox over here, right, I've got the fill is in front and the stroke is behind. So I'm actually affecting the fill right now instead of the stroke. So what I want to do is hit the X key on the keyboard. That switches from my fill to my stroke. So now I'm going to be adjusting the stroke because it's selected. And so I'm going to apply an effect to that stroke. All right. So distort, zigzag. There we go. So it's zigzagging. I'm going to change my points to smooth instead of corner, and I'm going to, I guess I'm going to do 5 ridges like that. Click OK. So now I've got a wavy line, much more cool. Now I'm going to apply a gradient fill to the stroke. Okay, so once again I can hit the less than key, and it's again going to use the same gradient that I used before. But this time I'm going to go back to my blue, right? So I'm going to double click this gradient slider, go to my swatches, find that deep blue. And for this one, I'm going to double click and make that. I guess I'll go with this lighter blue. In fact, again, I'm going to go and hold down the Shift key and click on one of the RGB sliders and drag it to the right. Of course, you may be working with CMYK sliders. Just depends on what your project is. If you're intending to output to screen, you're working in RGB. If you're intending to print, you're working with CMYK. Okay, so now I've got a gradient applied to a stroke, which is great. Now I want to turn your attention here to gradient on the stroke options. We've got gradient within the stroke, along the stroke, and across the stroke. This one is really cool. You should experiment with all of them, but I'm going to change it to across the stroke, and so now I get this more dimensional blend from light to dark across the stroke. So I could, hint that there's a highlight above and a shadow underneath, right? Or I can do what I did with the Fox gradients and move the highlight to the center about 50, and then Option or Alt click and drag the darker one back over here, and voila. Now I've got this more dimensional object. Pretty cool. So let me zoom out here. So I'm going to duplicate this now. I'm going to hit the R key on the keyboard to get the rotate tool, and remember, if you Option or Alt click the center point that you want to rotate around, which is going to be the center of his head, I'm going to rotate this thing, say 30 degrees, right? And make a copy of it. And now to repeat the last transformation you just did, you can just hit Command D or Control D. Anyway, so there you have it. Gradients in Illustrator. Incredibly powerful stuff. Good luck, practice, and have fun.